Two longtime union activists and fighters for the working class and the oppressed, Kieran Knutson and Cliff Willmeng, are running for union office in their respective locals in Minneapolis. These are two important campaigns not only for the members of these two unions, but for all workers. Oakland socialists have the opportunity to talk with both of them. Cliff got his start in political activism in the Battle of Seattle, the protests against the WTO in 1999. He is a longtime union activist, first in the Carpenters Union in Chicago, then after going to nursing school with nurses in Colorado, where he was also very active in the struggle against fracking. He has also been active in the MNA in Minneapolis since he moved there. He was fired from the hospital where he worked in Minneapolis for fighting for PPE for nurses. That case is on appeal. Both Cliff and Kieran have been very involved in the Black Lives Matter protests in Minneapolis. Kieran got his start in politics as a teenager when he organized against fascists. Before working for AT&T, Kieran worked at UPS for 10 years, where he was a steward and was involved in rank-and-file struggles. He has worked at AT&T for going on 17 years now, and has been a steward and elected chief steward. Here he explains why he is running for president.
I'm running for president of CWA Local 7250, sort of on three main points. The first one is to defend our jobs. AT&T is in the process of doing what they call headcount rationalization, massive downsizing of their workforce through layoffs and outsourcing and offshoring, which will mean the elimination of hundreds and thousands of living wage union jobs. The second point is about building and democratizing our union, putting the union under members' control, and building the union, organizing non-union workplaces. And the third point is that we need to be building for a working class uprising in this country, that the ruling class, the bosses, the corporations don't have any right to rule over us, and that their rule has been a disaster for working class people, and that we don't have much time to lose and we need to get moving on this. And that means that we need to organize with other working class people in other industries, unemployed and employed, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, gay, straight, and push to overthrow their rule.
Really, echoing what Kieran is saying, I mean, really, to me, 2020 could not have crystallized our position in this world as working class people any sharper. And, here within the course of the pandemic of COVID-19, you've got one lesson pulling out of this year that shows that that the bosses are willing to lead rank and file workers into workplaces, even at the risks of their lives, and that are willing to sacrifice us on that basis for the profit line.
We talked about the need to change the labor movement as a whole.
I think that the labor movement has suffered poor leadership at best for the last 50 years. I think that that's basically accumulated in a point where you've got frontline workers literally dying on the job from this pandemic. I think we need to reinvent the labor movement, or at least return it to its real essence, which was, a much more direct fight against capitalism and for better working conditions and standards for working class people. And I think that we can do it on a better basis, really fighting and joining with the fights against racism, systemic and otherwise. Also, as Kieran was suggesting, really making these unions run by the membership versus, paid staff, professional consultants.
Kieran talked about the union having a day-to-day presence for workers on the job and the role of the job stewards.
Some years ago, there was only a couple of stewards representing some 300 people, and they were all white and male. We changed that. We recruited stewards and built a stewards council. So we had 15 stewards instead of 4, and majority Black, majority people of color, majority women. and then took an aggressive stand towards things like, one of the big things was just towards disrespect. No one had to put up with abuse ever. And so anytime a manager was abusive, we would make a campaign around that. We would file grievances, but we wouldn't just leave it to grievances. We'd also do mobilizations around it. And we'd really force the issue so that managers got to learn the lesson that if they were going to be abusive to workers, that there was going to be a penalty to pay. And also, teach the lessons to workers that you don't have to put up with abuse, and that you don't have to, you don't have to think of yourself as less than anybody else in the workplace. And then from there, a lot of stuff, flows from that. Anytime that there was any kind of issue, we tried to make it, something that was not just an individual grievance, but something that was of concern to the workplace as a whole. And especially if there was somebody that had a grievance that did impact, other workers, we tried to sort of include the whole workforce in the grievance and educate people about it, let people know that this fight was going on, and then choose moments to try and mobilize support for the individual worker. So it wasn't just a case of sort of like these legal proceedings that happen behind closed doors that no one really knows about, but instead sort of like, the sort of, that people felt a sort of connection to the different struggles that were happening, and also participation in them. And then also it raised the expectations. So if any of the stewards started to get sort of like tired or maybe lazy or whatever, you still had a workplace that was sort of like, no, we're not supposed to accept that. We need to be fighting that. And that I think was a cultural change in the union and in the workplace.
Kieran talked about his plans for fighting the proposed layoffs at AT&T.
It can't be fought one local at a time, or one location at a time, or one district at a time. It has to be a sort of, union-wide or industry-wide effort. I do think, though, that there's some basis for that, because during the last round of contract negotiations, we had a number of CWA locals that successfully organized grievance strikes. Probably in a dozen different locations, locals did that on their own, basically, without any sort of assistance from the international. And to me, that shows that there's a willingness to fight, and that there's also a basis of unity across, different regions and different locals. And I think what needs to happen is that there needs to be a meeting of the different locals who represent workers employed by AT&T, and we need to have a very honest and forthright discussion about the fact that AT&T has made it crystal clear that they want to do massive downsizing, and we have to talk about what we're willing to do and what we're able to do to fight that. And I think everything needs to be on the table with that. I think we need to be thinking in terms of job actions. I think we need to be thinking in terms of mobilizations in the street. I think we need to be thinking in terms of pressing all the politicians and elected officials to take stands and say that there will be repercussions for AT&T, which is a profitable company.
To be blunt about it, my experience is that the overwhelming majority of the local leadership basically follows, especially on something like this, follows behind what the international leadership is and is not willing to do. And so the question of a coordinated campaign, then that raises the question of, do we have confidence in the international leadership doing what's necessary? And if not, isn't it necessary to build a rank and file, well, to be blunt about it, insurgency in the different locals, and for that to be coordinated?
Well, you've hit it right on the head there. We can't wait for the international leaders to organize a plan. It's up to workers themselves to organize a plan. And for me, the positive side of that, I would say, is that there is this experience of a number of locals organizing grievance strikes. And the CWA international leadership, I don't know their thinking behind it, but for whatever reason, they have not interfered with organizing the grievance strikes, but they haven't assisted them either. But what that means is there is a certain layer of people that have the experience of organizing and carrying out grievance strikes. And that's not something to sneeze at. To me, that's the basis of our, building the fight back. And we need to also talk honestly about it. Like, there's risks involved, and we have to talk about what those are. But there's also huge risks in not doing anything, and we need to be open and honest about that as well. And then I think we need to talk about getting to work and organizing people to take a stand.
Cliff relates this to planned layoffs in the hospital industry in Minneapolis.
Whether a company's making gobs of money or that they're making, gobs of money, but they don't feel that that's enough. COVID-19 is going to be used as a lever or a fulcrum to enact or to force cuts, concessions, crappy contracts, poor working conditions. It's already doing that. This is a do or die moment. And I think that we have to talk very seriously about what this means, because as far as I can tell, and as you pointed out, MNA knew that these cuts were coming. They knew that this hospital was going to be closed. They announced it and were, starting some smaller campaigns as far back as February. But today, there's nothing there. I mean, there's really, I'll tell you what's going to happen. There's going to be a statement that's put out that says that they oppose this. And there might be a march once we give our 10 days notice, according to the National Labor Relations Act, as we're supposed to as healthcare workers. And, the response becomes very scripted. And I think that it's become so scripted that it's emboldened the employers to take actions that they would maybe otherwise be hesitant to take, in fighting for our jobs and fighting for our contracts and all that sort of stuff, because because we're not getting that leadership that we should be from the internationals. This is going to come down to a rank and file rebellion. This is a critical time for the labor movement, but on the same basis, it presents enormous opportunity. And I think that it probably needs to extend outside of our kind of siloed unions or workplaces, and across the labor movement, and as well into the unorganized or unemployed. I think that this is a moment for a real working class movement that has probably been 70 years in the making.
We talked about programmatic demands like a 20-hour work week with no loss in pay and a $25 an hour minimum wage.
We have to point out, I think, that there's a pretty major vacuum that's been left by what I consider misleadership over the last 50 years of the labor movement. The situation is, the tension is ramping up. For us, it's it would be, I think that's a great idea, is reducing the work week to 20 hours, as well as equal pay for what you're doing. We should be fighting on a program of full employment. And my position with when they start talking about closing entire hospitals, my position is that if the executive class cannot maintain healthcare institutions, that those institutions should be taken over, and they should be run collectively by the people that do the work, the frontliners there, in collaboration with the communities that we serve. So there needs to be a transference of power, willing or unwillingly, and decision-making from those executive layers that have been using these industries like personal cash cows. And these institutions need to be taken over by the frontline workers. And I think that the details of how that would play out, that would be writing a script that we have not seen in a very long time, but it's probably more needed than it has been in generations.
One of the things that we need to do in this period is that any group of workers that begins to fight back, we need to sort of rally around and to make sure that they don't go down, that they win. And that out of that experience, there'll be the opportunity to sort of lay out class-wide demands. But I think that articulating them and popularizing them now is important.
We talked about labor's role in the Black Lives Matter protests.
I mean, first of all, it's been inadequate. It's been criminally inadequate. There have been some important exceptions, and those exceptions need to be built on, but they've been exception. If you have millions of people in this country standing up against racism and oppression, and the unions are missing in action, what are the unions for? For real, if they're about anything, then they need to be, with the people standing up. I mean, that's what I think, and that's what I'm telling my coworkers. And, that's the only thing I'm interested in. I'm not interested in unions that aren't interested in fighting back against racist oppression.
MNA put out a statement about it. They demanded the resignation of Bob Kroll, the fascist leader of the police union here in the Twin Cities, and notorious guy, for many years. But that's it. And imagine the potential that this could have had there been organized work stoppages around this. And for one, it would have given the unions relevance to an entire layer of people that wouldn't naturally look to the unions for help, solidarity, leadership, anything other than, sometimes nice talking points and, another political candidate endorsement. So, but of course, as soon as you start talking about significant direct action and, really leveraging our own strength, which is that work stoppage, the unions are going to come into conflict with their political allies in the Democratic Party.
Right.
And so they're already voluntarily handcuffed to and invested in that political class of people, and that to keep that relationship, there's a major opportunity cost. And there's a cost to maintain that relationship. That means that you have to keep your members in line, and away from any serious threats to power. So of course the unions, how could they not have done more? What an opportunity, and an opportunity that, that a lot of the rank and file didn't let dissuade them from getting down to the protests at the 3rd precinct and the 5th precinct and the Capitol and everywhere. I think that, obviously joining these kind of causes and opening up the idea of union solidarity and strength to new people, if that's not quintessential labor action, I really don't know what is.
We talked about Trump and the Proud Boys and the dangers they represent, and what is the alternative to seeing the Democrats as the only other option. From my point of view, the only other option would be a mass, radical, working-class political party that doesn't just run candidates for office, but actually organizes workers and young people to fight for their interests in the streets, in the communities, in the workplaces, and in the unions.
I think there's a real problem that you have a lot of working class people who don't like Biden and don't like Harris and don't like the Democratic Party, but they look at Trump and they're scared, And I think part of the problem is that there isn't a visible alternative to the Democrats in our society, and that's one of our major goals. Has to be to build a radical, in my opinion, a radical anti-authoritarian alternative to the political system in this country. And I think that we need to be trying to construct movements that are controlled by the rank and file of the movements, and that unions, when they participate in them, don't just try and sort of manipulate them, but actually participate in them as equals and bring their resources, make their resources available to the class as a whole. And I think we need to be sort of setting out big, but really, when I say they're big goals, they're sort of like the only goals that make sense at this point, which is to take power away from the class that's causing chaos and damage and possibly extinction on this planet.
I put forward a motion that's going to be voted on in the MNA delegate conference here just this month, that is calling for political independence of the Minnesota Nurses Association, and that it would be a sharp and clean financial break with supporting any candidate of the Democratic or Republican parties, that it would be bringing us back on the basis of bringing us back to solidarity unionism and organizing, and really working with the strengths that we have that we don't necessarily use all that much. The real essence of a mass organization would be to organize and coordinate direct action up to and including work stoppages. Know that we're going to make our mistakes, and but the only fundamental mistake that we can make right now is hoping that the situation will improve by doing the same things that we've attempted for the last 60 or 70 years.
We concluded by talking about the possibility of using their two campaigns to jointly build a rank and file movement, not just in their own unions, but across the labor movement, both locally and around the country.
I'd love it. I think that that's important because to me, what ends up happening is that nurses end up just talking to nurses, and communications workers talk to communications workers, and so there's not a lot of opportunity to synergize each other. Because I think we would find very fast that the issues that are taking place at AT&T, we're going to feel them in a distinct but almost identical way in the hospitals. I mean, it's the same system.
So I think it has to expand out. I think it has to connect with other unions. It has to have a sort of a class perspective outside of just a sort of narrow industry or narrow union look at things. I think that concretely, some things I've been thinking about would be, trying to connect the various anti-capitalist forces within the union movement together so that they form a certain kind of united front within the union movement in the Twin Cities, for instance.
I'd just like to request everybody to vote for Kieran. And, for myself, you can learn more about my campaign at frontlinersunited.net. I've got a Facebook page. It's Cliff Willmeng for MNA Board. I can honestly say that I've not felt a time where there's greater opportunity and, to really put together something new and something genuine and timely.
Cliff has been here a short time, but he's had a big impact, and he's been on the front page above the fold of the newspaper, and it not over something little, but over something big. Fighting for the safety of the people that are working on the front lines to care for people in a situation where there's a pandemic. And so I think that's a very, heroic role that he's played. I'm looking forward to this. And I think that, whether we win or lose, we'll get to sort of gauge our sort of the strength of the support within the union, within the class for the ideas that we're putting forward. But I'm optimistic that people are in the mood to fight, and that there's a mood for not sitting back, not just taking shit, but actually, pushing back and pushing back hard.
You can find the campaign for Cliff and his fellow nurses at frontlinersunited.net. And you can find Kieran's on Facebook at Kieran for CWA 7250. Ballots go out in the mail for both elections, so we urge members to be on the lookout for them. And if you live in the Minneapolis area and run across nurses or AT&T workers, urge them to vote for Cliff or Kieran. It's important.